Good evening, everyone. My name is Casey Arnold, and I serve as Vice President of Engagement for the University of Illinois Alumni Association. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, as we very much appreciate your support for our ongoing Alumni College speaker series. We're excited to welcome back several repeat attendees this evening. But before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to take a moment to talk about some exciting things happening at your alma mater. Of course, there's a lot to celebrate on the football front this year, and we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Memorial Stadium in a special way. When you sign up for a $150 annual membership, you'll receive an exclusive limited edition snow globe commemorating this historic milestone. This beautifully crafted snow globe showcases Memorial Stadium and captures the spirit of Illinois in a unique keepsake, so don't miss your chance to add this piece of Illini history to your collection. All snow globes will be mailed out starting December 1st, just in time for the holidays. Sign up for your membership today and bring home a piece of Illini pride. In addition to our membership program, we also have some great opportunities for alumni to engage with us from wherever you call home. You can visit allinilink.illinois.edu to join Illini Link, our online networking and mentorship program where you can connect with thousands of fellow Illini from around the world. You can also join our online book club by visiting pbc.guru/uillinois. Joining the book club is free and provides our alumni with an opportunity to connect with one another over shared interests in literature, history, and professional development. And if you love the speaker series, please make a note to register for our next session, a conversation with Chancellor Jones, scheduled for December 17th. Registration will open next month. Finally, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I would like to remind everyone to please submit questions during the presentation via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have time left at the end for questions, and we will get through as many as possible in the time allotted. Also, if you are interested in reviewing this presentation at a later date, a recording will be posted to the speaker series section of our website within the next 10 business days. Now let's get to why we've all logged on tonight, which is here to hear from another member of our esteemed Illinois faculty. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Brian J. Gaines. Professor Gaines is the Honorable W. Russell Arrington Professor in State Politics for the University of Illinois System and a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He received a BA with honors from the University of British Columbia and AM and PhD degrees from Stanford University, where he was also the playing president of the Ice Hockey Club. Most of his research deals with elections, electoral rules, and public opinion. With Wendy Cho and Jake Bowers, he co-edited The Political Methodologist from 2010 to 2013. From 2011 to 2015, he was the editor of American Politics Research. And between 2005 and 2007, he completed marathons on all 7 continents. With that, it is my great pleasure to turn the evening program over to Professor Gaines.
Thank you very much. I have too much material, and I do not intend to filibuster and take the entire hour. I hope I speak for about 40 minutes and then allow lots of time for some questions. I will undoubtedly speak quickly because that's what I always do, but I will try not to speak absurdly quickly, even though I have so many things to cover. So I'll give you a very brief primer on the Electoral College. This is about close presidential elections or ones that were difficult to resolve. And the first thing to say is that the presidency is not a direct election, that we all talk as though it is. People say, I'm going to vote for Trump, I'm going to vote for Harris, I voted for Reagan. But we don't actually do that unless we're electors. What we in fact do is vote for presidential electors, and then in a second step, they vote for the president. And so I'm not going to, I could easily take the entire time to go through every feature of the Electoral College. I just want to emphasize a couple of things about it. And then I'm going to talk mostly about those 4 elections that are bolded, 1824, 76, 1960, and 2000. Maybe I'll end up speaking about 2020 and 2024, which is not, I don't yet know if it will be a close election, and I hope it's not one that's difficult to resolve. We'll see. And the last thing, I think, if time allows, I'll talk a little bit about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a complicated, interesting, but not yet completed attempt, more or less, to end run the Electoral College. So it's not in place yet, so I'll talk about the Electoral College, and then I'll tell you what's underway as an effort to try to get around it. What do I want to say with the Electoral College? Well, start with the part that's in bold here. Each state appoints in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives which the state may be entitled in Congress, So how are the electors chosen? Right now, mostly they're chosen by winner take all. The candidate that gets the most votes in the state, and I'm already talking as though we have direct election. It's not the candidates, the slate of electors, but those are the electors chosen. If there are more Republican than Democratic votes, then they will be Trump electors. If it's more Democratic than Republican votes, it will be Harris electors in 2024. But that's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says the legislature decides. So the states, in fact, didn't always use popular vote. In my first case, 1824, it'll turn out to be one of the important features that not a substantial number of the states weren't allocating electors according to a popular vote. There wasn't a popular vote. The last two states not doing so in 1876, Colorado was remember the Centennial State, was so newly admitted they didn't have time to organize an election. So this was a late instance of the state legislature choosing the electors. South Carolina in 1860 was the last holdout from the start of the nation onward that had not used popular election. Right, so that's an archaic feature. It's not the case anymore that any states pick their electors. But back to the language, in such manner as the legislature may direct. So I said, winner take all. The most votes is going to be the candidate with the most votes is the one whose electors are chosen. But that's state law. That's not constitutional. There's an asterisk or a footnote in most American politics textbooks, or even in the occasional article about what's or forecast of what's going to happen in this election, that Maine and Nebraska are the two slightly odd cases at the moment that don't use statewide plurality. They allocate the two electors who are allocated to or apportioned to those states according to their Senate seats to the winner of the state, and then they use the congressional districts, and the candidate with the most votes in each congressional district gets that elector. So Maine did this in the 1970s, and now has split a couple of times. Nebraska followed in 1991. This is a picture of what Maine has looked like. There are three dots showing this from 72, 76, 80, all the way through to 20. You can't tell there are three dots early on because the first district, second district, and the state are essentially right on top of each other. The vertical column here is the Democratic vote share. So when it 72, 76, 80, 84, and 88, the Republican candidates won all three electoral votes. There's a little bit more separation. The first and second district are looking less like each other as we move on, but the Democrats have a winning streak for a while, starting with the Clinton elections. And then the first and second district look less and less alike. The vertical axis is not drawn out from 0 to 1 here, so they're not wildly apart, but they're far enough apart that in the last two times, the second district went to the Republican candidate, and the first district, the Democratic, and the state as a whole to the Democrat. So they split the electors. It's 4-0 all the way through until the last two, and then we have one Republican and three Democratic. It's a small state. We're talking only one bonus elector for, in this case, the Republican Party. Nebraska has split the other way so that the Democrats were able to claw one away from a state that otherwise would be straight Republican. As I say, those are footnotes and asterisks. It's not extremely important to the way those elections were resolved, but in a close enough election, every elector counts. And I'm back to the structural point that the way that the electors are allocated by state is determined by state law. It's not a constitutional feature. And as long as I'm dwelling on that point for a second, the word college is not in the Constitution. We call it the Electoral College, this institution whereby we have an indirect election, the people vote, and the electors vote. That's in the Constitution. The people voting first is, as I suggested, we haven't always had popular votes, isn't in fact an original feature of the Constitution, but the electors themselves are. What is it that people don't like about the Electoral College? What's complicated and it's confusing. It's a little complicated for sure. Lots of electoral systems are complicated. I spend a lot of my time explaining cumulative voting, ranked choice voting, how proportional representation works. So it certainly isn't uniquely complicated. And we had civics lessons in the recent elections, 2000 and 2016, that drove home to people that even if they always thought about the presidency as being one with the most votes in the nation, that isn't how it's arranged. Is it antiquated? Well, it's certainly old. And the feature that I'll talk about when I get to my first case of 1824, the contingent election, if the Electoral College doesn't really work, then the U.S. House chooses. And I think that's a feature that particularly bothers people if they think it hasn't happened since 1824, but if it were to happen again, it would strike people as extremely antiquated. Maybe is not even a strong enough word. That obsolete. It's not. It doesn't feel like modern democracy in the least. Is the Electoral College non-majoritarian? Yeah, it is. But on the other hand, everybody knows the rules, so it isn't the case that the candidates themselves, the campaigns are trying to get the most votes across the nation, and they're shocked to discover that that isn't the way the presidency is won after all. And don't let anybody from any parliamentary democracy complain to you at length that the Electoral College is unfair because it's not majoritarian, because most of the world's heads of government are not elected by majoritarian systems. So the prime ministers in parliamentary systems are the leaders of parties that either form coalitions with other parties and get the majority of seats, or their own party alone gets the majority of seats, but there's no guarantee that that party won the majority of the vote. And in multi-party systems, it's quite a rarity. Is it unfair? Is it biased? It's biased in favor of big states. That's my point number 5. But you can miss a point about big states and little states. I'm sorry, it's biased in favor of big states and against little, in favor of little and against big. Because the electors are allocated by members of Congress, including the Senate, every state gets 2 senators. The U.S. representatives are apportioned by population. That means smaller states get a few more electors than they would get if the entire electoral college were apportioned by population because of the Senate part. But the thing you could miss is the growing states are actually harmed by the allocation because it's done every 10 years. And that means states, as the time moves on and you get an election like 2000 or 2020, that's at the end of an apportionment period before there's a new census and a reapportionment, don't have enough electoral college weight. And it gets adjusted upwards, but then the reapportionments are periodic. So is it biased in favor of the GOP? Maybe it looks that way lately, but I'll at least cast some doubt on that. And then I think maybe the thing people would say is those wasted votes that bug us so much that you get all the electors for winning California or get all the electors for winning Pennsylvania. One of them can be a huge win for in the case of California, the Democratic candidate usually. If it's Pennsylvania this time around, it's going to be won narrowly by somebody, and they get all the electors. So aren't there a lot of wasted votes? And a quick rebuttal on that, I guess, is the winner-take-all system is not a constitutional feature. It's state law. The states are free to change. I'm going to label a few of my slides digression just to remind myself not to talk too long on them. So my brief digression on state laws, Maine and Nebraska are footnotes. Has anybody else come close? Colorado had a vote, this is now 20 years ago, but 2004, there was an amendment that would have effected an immediate switch. So for the 2004 presidential election, if courts permitted that, and that was an unclear point, so that they would have had proportional elector allocation, a 60-40 vote. Instead of giving all of the electors to the candidate that got 60% of the vote, would give 60% to that party and 40 to the other. But that amendment lost badly, 35 to 65, so it never got tested in court. Nebraska this year, there was serious talk about getting rid of their congressional district allocations so that it was pretty openly that we don't want any chance of the Democrats getting that one extra elector in the Omaha area. So let's just switch to the system that all the 48 other states use. But that failed. The unicameral nonpartisan legislature, there weren't enough members who were willing to go for that. And so with whatever we are now, 11 days out to election, Nebraska is not changing this time. So how do you become president? As of this year, there are 56 electoral college districts. That's the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Didn't have them for the whole history. It's not going to be part of my story in 1824, 1876. But after the 23rd Amendment, DC gets some electoral votes, plus those congressional districts in the states, the few states that have changed their state law. They vary in their weight. The smallest ones are those congressional districts. They get 1 elector each, 54 electors in the giant District of California. And then that adds up to 538. So the majority of 538 is 270 or more. 538 is an even number. This might turn out to be an important point in the election when they're counting everything up in a few days. So a 269 tie is possible. Any outcome that doesn't see either one of the candidates get 270 or more of the electoral votes is not resolved by the Electoral College, and then the resolution is done in the U.S. House. So the last point about that, which will be my 1824 story, is when the U.S. House votes, it's not a vote of 435 members. It's a vote of 50 states. So within the states, the caucuses vote, and then the vote is tabulated by state. So it's an unusual procedure we don't see in the House much. And it hasn't happened in a long time, 200 years, but it has happened. Another thing I don't really have time to talk about, but I could easily spend 90 minutes. It's extremely interesting, is I said a few times, the states get as many electors as they have members of Congress, the 2 senators plus the U.S. representatives. How many U.S. representatives do the states get? It's the size of the House then divided out in proportion to population. The size of the House has been fixed at 435, but that's not constitutional. That's only since the 1920s, and it's statutory. And it turns out to be a really interesting and difficult mathematical problem to do the rounding, to figure out who gets this extra state. If a state deserves 1.5 members and another deserves 4.5, one of them might get 1 and the other might get 5, or 2 and 4. How do you do that? That's not a trivial matter, and it's got an extremely interesting history, and I won't say any more about it today, except it's part of the story here. All right, so the difficult, strange elections. The first normal listing of these is often the cases where Because of this indirect feature, somebody won the presidency without winning the popular vote. Here's one listing of them: 1824 and 76, two of the cases I'll talk about. 1888, I'm not going to say much about. It's true that there was a difference between the winner and the popular vote winner, but it wasn't extremely controversial in the resolution. 2016, the recent ones that I said sort of reminded people who weren't paying close attention that you don't want the most votes nationwide. Necessarily what you want is the most electoral votes. And I'm going to add 1960 to this list. Here we have 1824. I'm finally onto my first case. This is some language not from a contemporary account of it, from a Wall Street Journal editorial in 2016, calling it America's first rigged election. Andrew Jackson had every reason to consider himself the victor of the presidential election of 1824. He'd won the most popular vote, most electoral votes too, but he didn't end up president. How did that happen? Here's the quick version of it. It was a four-way race. And the first thing that was unusual, and it's not like today, is the party system was in a state of flux. The Federalist Party had more or less withered. And so these candidates were all from the same party. We got a four-way division of the race, partly because there wasn't a primary system in place to pick one nominee for each party, and there weren't two viable parties. The candidates were all from what was called the Democratic Republican Party. It's got both of the modern names attached to it. Jackson had the largest popular vote share, substantially more than Adams. But from his popular vote share, that didn't translate into more electoral college votes, because the electoral college votes are a portion according to state size. So you can get a lot of votes in a state that doesn't deliver as many electoral votes. So he won 8 states. That's more than Adams, but he didn't have as many electoral votes there. But he won more electoral votes in those states that didn't have a popular vote. 6 of those at the time, he won New York, Louisiana, South Carolina. They're comparatively large states. Adams won smaller states, Delaware and Vermont. So you add it up, and Jackson's got 99 votes, and that's not a majority of the number. It didn't give him a win. Adams had 84. Henry Clay and Wim Crawford had a sizable number as well. So by the constitutional procedure, the U.S. House was going to choose, and then I've given away the end line here. John Quincy Adams wins. He gets 13. It's the bare majority. It's the number he needed to win. Beats Jackson. It's remembered in textbooks, and at the time described by Jackson and his supporters as a corrupt bargain. And the claim is Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, had influence in the House, was able to sway voters so that he could persuade House members to vote for Adams rather than the rightful winner, because of his popular vote majority or electoral vote majority, Jackson. Jackson, this is one of many quotations from him. You see, the Judas of the West has closed the contract, will receive the 30 pieces of silver. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? Probably there was a great deal of corruption in many countries at this point in history, but here's my quick rebuttal. This is essentially an argument made by colleagues of mine, a former student, Jeff Jenkins, and my one-time colleague, Brian Sala. I'm just going to steal their argument whole cloth. Was it a corrupt bargain? One way to answer that is to ask, well, what would those House members have done if they were voting sincerely? And one way to figure out what a sincere vote looks like is to ask, we had lots of data on how they voted on other roll calls. What do those roll calls suggest about their voting patterns? This is a picture of the most popular procedure for detecting using roll calls where people lie in some kind of an ideological space. So I have a two-dimensional scatter plot. There are S's and NEs here. Each of those is a member of the House, and S or NEs is symbol according to what region they're from. And the common space, nominate first dimension, second space. This is the jargon, but just think about this as an ideology. There's a left and a right, and there's a top and a bottom. And the candidates, how do I know who's on the left and who's in the center and who's on the right? I just extract that from their voting behavior. So they vote together, they vote on lots of things. And it happens that Crawford, Jackson, Adams, Calhoun, who was the vice president's nominee, he's not part of the story. They all had voting records as well. So I can put them in the same space, and that's what Jenkins and Sala did. You then say, so suppose people vote in a sincere way. They vote for the nearest of the candidates. They're choosing who they'd like to be president from Adams, Jackson, and I think I didn't say this out loud, but Clay is out of the running here. So it's Crawford picking from once the House votes, it's the top 3. What would a sincere vote look like? Just assume each member votes for the closest candidate, closest in ideological space, the one who's most like him in roll call behavior. So in that respect, most like him probably in policy preferences. You can use both of those dimensions that are drawn here, or just one of them. Either way, it looks like mostly the states voted the way they would vote sincerely. The members voted, and then the member votes turn into state votes. If you look at the two-dimensional predictions, there are no wins by Adams that look like they're strategic or insincere, that they required a corrupt bargain, that Henry Clay had to twist some arms. Essentially, he won the states where he was the closest candidate to the majority of the members. Jackson picked up 3 he probably oughtn't to have. Crawford got 1. If you think I don't think I need 2 dimensions, I think just 1 dimension is enough, which is a topic of debate amongst the political scientists who like to use these scores that are derived from the roll calls. Adams did pick up a couple, but not as many as Jackson. So quick story on that, doesn't really look like a corrupt bargain. It looks very much like a sincere vote. That's an interesting rebuttal to the usual historian's account. If I'm back to my topic about, well, this is certainly was a difficult resolution of a presidential election. What's the lesson for today? First, I should finish the story. Jackson didn't just complain privately about the corrupt bargain. He complained loudly and bitterly. His supporters did for 4 years, and then he got his revenge. He wasn't the 6th president. He was the 7th because he beat John Quincy Adams in the rerun, and it was a clear, more traditional win. He got the majority of the popular vote. Now, almost all the states. South Carolina was a holdout, as I mentioned, but Delaware as well. But they're not using popular votes. He wins a big electoral margin to go with his big popular vote margin. So if you're a Jackson supporter, you can say there's a happy ending. But the provision for a House resolution is still there. So it's not impossible. We don't have a 4-way split this time. There are some minor candidates running. Nobody thinks there's going to be anything like this kind of division with lots of each of the 4 candidates, Cornel West or someone else, drawing some electoral vote. But I did say it's an even number of electors, so a 269 tie is not impossible. And if that were the case, the resolution, assuming the electors all voted as instructed, as they're pledged to vote, would be a House resolution. I think very few people would think that that's a satisfactory conclusion to the election, but it's possible. Jump ahead in time, 1876. This is a book, Fraud of the Century. There's a lot of heated rhetoric about how corrupt 1824 was. Here's some more of the same kind of rhetoric. Ethically sorted, legally questionable presidential election in American history. I don't have time for the full context, but here's another 4-way split a few years before, but it's not the kind of difficult 4-way split. Abraham Lincoln wins in 1860 without a majority of the popular vote, but with a majority of the electoral vote. Then we have a more traditional 1864 election. Lincoln's reelected in the midst of a difficult war. Grant wins again pretty easily in 1868. There's a nice wrinkle in 1872. Grant wins again and wins a hefty electoral margin, but Horace Greeley, his opponent, dies after the voting. And this is just a reminder that the 2 stages, having a popular vote, and then after the passage of some time, the electors voting, and after more passage of time, the inauguration, can he open up this difficulty that the candidates can depart this vale of tears. So how this is reported is often the Greeley vote scattered because people didn't want to cast, the electors didn't want to cast posthumous votes for him. The other ominous thing here is this asterisk that says there were elections in Arkansas and Louisiana, but the results were invalidated because of allegations of fraud. That's going to be the 1876 story in part. At the county level, we see the usual blue and red colors here. There's a pretty Democratic blue south, but with patches of red, and important ones. Pretty red north. The west and Midwest are gray because they're not states yet, and then the far west is kind of a mix. Here's how the states voted, and the critical part is these 3 red southern states. The Republicans ultimately would get South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Look at the vote totals. Hayes, the Republican, does win the Electoral College vote by 1 elector, extremely close, but without having won the popular vote. So what's going on? In brief, there are 2 things that are competing here. Throughout the South, the voting is marked by pretty rampant vote suppression, violent suppression of the vote, especially of African-American voters who are uniformly Republican at the time. And in turn, then, when the canvassing takes place, there's fairly clear, dodgy, I think I've used here, but vote counting by canvassers, which is not just counting up the votes, but excluding some votes as being invalid because they're fraudulent. And it turns out the counting always seems to favor the Republicans. So competing slates of electors are put forward in complicated ways, and I definitely don't have time to go through all the details of how in each of these states. But in the end, they end up submitting a Democratic and a Republican slate of electors, both claiming to have won legitimately. In some objective sense, I think you could say the tabulation was favoring the Republicans was pretty openly fraudulent in some of the cases. The vote suppression was, if anything, worse. And so you kind of choose your poison. If you're saying who should have won, depends on how much you care about violent gangs preventing people from voting who are trying to vote, or tabulators cheating. There's one other weird bit of this. There was one of the Republican electors in Oregon was held a public office. He had a postal appointment. He should not have been an elector according to the Constitution. That meant he should have been replaced by the other Oregon electors, which would have been, they picked another Republican, be uncontroversial under Oregon state law. But the Democrats were, this is a knife-edge election. They pressed hard saying, there's no vacancy. The Oregon law says there's a vacancy if, in the event of a vacancy, the other electors should pick the replacement. But what happened here was that all the votes cast for him, since he wasn't eligible to be elected, are void. So the winner should be the next highest vote getter. That's a Democrat. And they pressed that argument. So the Oregon electors were up for grabs as well. How was this resolved? It turned out the Republicans control the Senate, the Democrats control the House. I don't know who's going to control the House and Senate after the next election, but it won't amaze me if we end up in this position with divided control. The Republicans look pretty comfortably in place to control the Senate. The Democrats feel, I think, pretty confident about the House, so maybe we'll be there again. So they split, and they had to decide what to do with the competing slates of electors, and they basically couldn't decide. All the Republicans, they formed 5-member committees, and they split up straight party lines. So they came up with a resolution mechanism, which was to add to this 3 members, 3 Republicans from the Republican-dominated Senate, 3 Democrats from the Democratic-controlled House, add a minority, two Democrats from the Senate, 2 from the Republicans for the House, and then add 5 Supreme Court justices. And the only reason this was supposed to work was most people agreed that David Davis was an independent, that they could get 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and have this one independent, and everything would hang on him. All right, so Illinois Democrats screw everything up. After this deal is in place, this commission is going to resolve what to do with the competing slates of electors. But the Illinois Democrats elect David Davis to the United States Senate. The United States Senate is not directly elected yet, and they choose him. He recuses himself from the committee now that he's going to be a senator, even though he isn't yet a senator. He's still a member of the Supreme Court. He's replaced with a Republican. All the votes thereafter, there's a series of votes. They're all straight party votes. So it's resolved on straight party lines. It's kind of anticlimactic, and it's important as well because this leads to the end of Reconstruction. The difficulty of that election was, in part, it was held with what is basically an occupying force from the North that was definitely Republican-leaning, trying to suppress what was definitely a Democratic-leaning local electorate, that's the white voters, and trying to enforce the voting rights of the African Americans voters who were essentially Republican voters. The usual textbook telling of 1876 was part of the deal was the House let Hayes win as long as there's an agreement to end Reconstruction. This is a quotation from a letter at the time. I added the word white that as a reassurance to, not from Hayes himself, but from a Hayes ally, that he, in the strongest possible manner, had a great desire to have him adopt a policy that will give the, white was understood, people of the states of South Carolina and Louisiana the right to control their own affairs. So 1876, the Republicans win the short-term prize, but the Democrats, at the end of Reconstruction, they kick the Republicans out and they dominate the South thereafter, and it becomes a one-party state and a setback for the voting rights of African Americans for 90 years. 1960 is not usually on this list. Why have I included it in my list if it's a close election, but it's not one where Kennedy lost the popular vote, is it? So it is. It's a little tricky. I think I have time without needing to use all of it. The background on this one, remember 1948, very close election, but seemingly won by Dewey on election night. He thought he'd won, but these close states that had a margin of less than 1%, the big ones ultimately went to Truman, so he won. And the important part is this, in context terms, is this Strom Thurmond Dixiecrat, a chunk of the Democrats from the South, split away because they wanted to essentially keep in place the victory of 1876, the end of Reconstruction. They're segregationists. They did not want a candidate who was going to take away the rights of Southern whites to control the South and continue to suppress the black vote. You get to the 1960s, that's 48, a couple of years, election cycles later. The Alabama Democratic primary is all about which kind of Democrats are going to be the electors. Are they going to be the kind who are loyal to the party and to whoever the candidate is, Northern or Southern, or are they going to be free or independent electors who say their job is to protect Alabama's state rights, and that means we don't want a Democrat who's a civil rights, voting rights sort. So that will be our whole mission, is to make sure we get a Southern, or at least a friendly to the South, Democrat. In the primary, there's a complicated system. There's a recount, but in the end, they split. The 5 loyalists, those are the ones who will back anybody, including Kennedy, get primary slots, but 6 free electors get them. And another feature, this is now obsolete, but it was true for much of American history. Alabama voters in the general election were not picking a slate. They were picking electors. Elector by elector, they picked which one they wanted. And Democrats who liked Kennedy had a dilemma, and Democrats who hated Kennedy had a dilemma. They had a mix of pro-Kennedy and anti-Kennedy Democrats. They could throw their votes, some of their votes to Republicans or prohibition candidates, whatever they liked, but they couldn't have 11 pro-segregation or 11 anti-segregation Democrats because the primary had already split the spots. So when people add up the vote totals, they usually just give all the Democratic vote to Kennedy, and then you get something that looks like this. It says Alabama's final vote was 5 electoral votes to Kennedy, who got, up here, this many votes. Nixon got fewer votes and no electors, and Harry Flood Byrd got 6 votes. And it looks like, oh, those must have been faithless electors who voted against the way they pledged. They were very much the opposite. They did exactly what they promised. And in fact, after the popular vote, they spent the intervening weeks trying hard to persuade other Southern Democrats not to support Kennedy, that this was their chance to, even if they'd pledged to do so, they didn't have to. They could join these free or independent Democrats and back Byrd or back someone else to get a promise that there would be no civil rights or voting rights to come. So you correct for that, and then I skipped over this quickly, but Georgia had a long ballot in some of the counties, and it turns out there's some variation across the Georgian, the electors, how many votes they got. You try to adjust for that. Nixon won the popular vote. Well, so what? In some respects, I started with this. You don't win the presidency by winning the most popular votes. You win the electoral vote. So Kennedy won the electoral vote with a close margin, but he's nowhere near the closest here. This is leaving out 1876. 2000 will be our closest race. There's some other close ones. 1960 is not that close. But there's another interesting thing about 1960. It is close in the sense that there were a lot of very close states in this blue region here. These Hawaii, Illinois, Missouri, and New Mexico, New Jersey are all states won by less than 1%. Had they flipped a little bit and been Nixon instead of Kennedy votes, Nixon could have won it. But he couldn't have won it with just one of them. So Hawaii was knife-edged. It was in a recount initially given to Kennedy. It was flipped and then flipped again. But Illinois is the one I want to talk about, because the story of Illinois afterwards, which was the second closest state here, it's this long blue line that's just above the 50-50 line here, where the Democrats barely win it. There was a lot of rumors, there were a lot of allegations that it was stolen. The Chicago Tribune said, well, once an election stolen in Cook County, it stays stolen. There are lots of the circumstantial evidence included things like there were precincts where there was no housing because all the housing had been destroyed in preparation for a freeway construction, and yet there were some votes counted. There's a quotation here. Somebody said that he'd heard that J. Edgar Hoover was sure Nixon had won it, but they just let Robert Kennedy decide afterwards if there's anything to follow up on. There's a little bit of hard evidence, and it's a nice, interesting footnote in history as well. There was an extremely close race for the Cook County State's Attorney. Benjamin Adamowski lost this by less than 1% to future Illinois Supreme Court Justice Daniel Ward. But Illinois law didn't have a provision about presidential vote recount, but there was a challenge recount provision for candidates who were within 5%. Adamowski was well within that. If he paid for it, they'd get a recount, so he paid for it. This is a picture of one of the cards that was prepared by his attorney. It's handwritten on one side, and then somebody typed up the totals, and then they made hand notations about what happened in the recount. The quick version is the Democrats who are in Cook County started the slow walk. A judge said, speed it up. We have to know. We want to know before the presidential inauguration, even though this is not a recount of the presidency. It's a recount for Cook County, the state's attorney. In the end, Nixon picked up some votes. Adamowski picked up a lot more votes. And this is only in the paper ballot precincts, and there were a lot of machine precincts. So how many votes were lost by tabulation error alone? There are other kinds of fraud, but just by assuming that this recount gave us an indication of how much either error or fraud, and it turned out to be the Republicans who were shortchanged. So it's hard to say exactly. The historian who wrote the book on this, I'm drawing all this from Edmund Kalina's book, Courthouse Over White House. And in fact, these cards, which are now in my possession, are cards that Kalina had for years, but I wrote to him asking if he'd share his data, and he sent me the whole box of cards and said, I'm never going to work on it again. So he thinks there's no final resolution. It's not clear who won it. Kennedy carried Illinois by about 8,800 votes. It looks like about that many were stolen in Cook County, but who knows how many were stolen elsewhere. But Adamowski was robbed. He lost by 26,000. He think at least 30,000 were in Cook County who cheated. What if it had gone to the House? It wouldn't have gone to the House on Illinois alone. You'd need to have flipped something else. So if Hawaii had flipped, Illinois had flipped, and Missouri had flipped, then it could have gone to the House. But Democrats controlled most of the delegation, so probably Kennedy would still have won. But you never quite know about those southern delegations, these schemers in Alabama. Could they have engineered something there? Probably not, but it didn't get there. It's an extremely close election, 1960 to 2000. Another picture of an extremely close election, but this time Florida. I said Hawaii was just about in the line 1960. Florida is right on the line. This is a 50-50 state. In the end, New Mexico was almost as close, but it didn't matter because it had so little electoral weight. So 2000 was entirely about Florida, and people will remember now my undergraduates. I say these things out loud, and then I catch myself thinking, well, you guys won't remember because you're all between 19 and 24 years old. But anyone who's my age will remember watching the messiness of the recounts in Florida. So what happened was, what can happen in the system? The big states like California and Texas that weren't terribly close, all the electors go one way, to the Republicans. In Texas case, California, all the Democrats. But Florida is a big state, and it's right on the line. And in an extremely close election, then you start noticing all the warts in voting and all the difficult parts and all the error that occurs in essentially all the elections, but it's not so obvious until it's really, really close and everything hangs on it. So I said New Mexico was too close to call, but nobody paid any attention. It doesn't matter who won. There was this confusion in the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, a ballot that was designed not in some kind of a conspiracy by Republicans, but by a well-meaning Democrat to help voters who have poor eyesight, but turned out to be very confusing and definitely, almost certainly cost about 2,000 votes to Gore, and that's the margin. So you could say that cost him the election. There were all kinds of errors, though, and again, this also is a topic that deserves at least 90 minutes. The election was called by the networks for Gore before all the precincts in the central time zone and the panhandle part of Florida had closed. Then they reversed it. Lots of argument about whether that cost one candidate or the other some votes. In the end, I think the simple thing to say was the recounting that was taking place was chaos. The Florida Supreme Court was controlled by Democrats. It was almost entirely Democrats. The Florida law said the Secretary of State had to certify at a deadline. The Republican Secretary of State said we've reached the deadline, the recounts are not completed, so the Republican has won. The Democratic-dominated Supreme Court said, nope, we need more time. The Supreme Court of the United States then intervened and said, clarify why this is so. And then a few days later, ended the recount in the Bush v. Gore decision, and then Gore conceded. Later recounts by the media, academics, and others, if you want to desperately find someone who says the Gore won, you can find one. If you want to find someone that says Bush would have won anyway, you can find one. I think that there isn't a definitive, final, error-free, bias-free tabulation. People have done analysis of the overseas vote. They've done lots of analysis of the Palm Beach vote, that inconsistencies across counties and the way the recounts were administered. There's a lot to sink your teeth in an exceptionally close election. It turns out to be essentially impossible to say who won. Former dean of the law school here, one of the Amar brothers, he writes frequently with his brother, has a book, an article, a long article, almost a book, Eradicating Bush League Arguments Root and Branch, which is extremely critical of the Bush v. Gore decision. And I am not going to give you this whole quotation, but what part of the criticism is, this was a terrible way to resolve a presidential election because the Supreme Court thrust itself in and then did so in it was partisan in the ugliest imaginable way because the Republican appointed judges voted against the Democratic appointed judges. I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to summarize what we learned from 2000. It was not resolved in an obviously worse way than 1876, which also in the end involved the Supreme Court. It's true the Congress brought it in, but they brought it in because they couldn't resolve it, and they thought maybe the justices can, and then they turned out they did, but not in the way that was anticipated because the Illinois Democrats messed everything up. Very close elections really can't be resolved in a completely controversy-free way. Is it unfortunate to have the court involved? Well, what infuriates the Amars, and I give you just the tiniest quotation from their article, is this theory that others have put forward, that an independent state legislature that takes that language I started with, each state shall appoint as in the manner the legislature directs its presidential electors, and says legislature, does that mean the process of state lawmaking that includes the legislature but might be direct democracy and includes the governor and it's overseen by the Supreme Court, or does it mean the legislature? The ISL theory says it means the legislature. The state Supreme Court should not be interfering. The Amars think that's insane. And I don't entirely disagree, but I think they're a little bit relaxed and insouciant about what if the state Supreme Court, though, is behaving in a way that seems objectionable. In a presidential election, there's clearly a federal interest. I think it's a little rich to be outraged that the federal Supreme Court would get involved and not leave things to state Supreme Courts if it's clear that everything hangs on one state, as it was in 2000 in Florida, and the state Supreme Court is entirely composed of members from one party in a 50-50 state, that doesn't seem like it's going to be controversy-free. You're quite right. I'm probably don't have enough time to take this last bullet point, but in Pennsylvania 2020, I think lots and lots of allegations of rampant fraud, very little proof, if any. But what did happen was the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania essentially intervened and broke a deal that had been brokered between the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature on election administration, and said, we have our own preferences, let's substitute them. They turned out to be preferences that favored the Democrats. The Democrats carried the state. Is that fraud? No. Is it tabulation that looks a little bit like the tabulation of 1876? Like it was had a partisan motivation. It did look that way. Who polices Supreme Courts? If state Supreme Courts, if not the federal Supreme Court, nobody. I'm almost at what I promised I'd stop, so I'll just give you 1 to 2 minutes on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. If the Electoral College has these difficulties that it can come down to a single state, and then we are stuck with the resolution one state, and maybe a state Supreme Court is going to adjudicate, and that doesn't seem like it's in the national interest. So you have to bring the National Supreme Court in, and that bothers people too. Why don't we just have the national most votes wins? The Interstate Compact is an attempt to do that. States write laws that say we're going to give our electors now, not to the state, the candidate who gets the most votes statewide, but to the national popular vote winner. But the trick is it's a contingent law, it's a compact. We won't do it until all the states in the compact agree. And collectively, we have 270 votes, so that our votes together are determinative. We have enough votes that we, even with the states not in the compact, we have enough that our collective vote will make the difference. This was an idea hatched after the 2000 election. No states moved on it until almost the 2008 was here, and then a lot of states have in the meantime. So this is just showing the timeline of joining. These are all states where they've passed a state law, and Illinois was pretty early on in this, jumping on this bandwagon. Most recently, Maine did, Minnesota just before that. But we haven't hit 270, so none of these states has changed the way it's giving out electors, and the compact hasn't taken place yet. To do so, this is a little too hard to explain, but basically all the states that have done it have been pretty blue states, and they've either been overriding Republican vetoes, or they've waited till a Republican who's in office is standing in the way, was out of the governor's office. So this last picture is showing the Democratic margin in 2012 on the horizontal axis. The dark dots are the compact members. In essence, the states that are joining are the most Democratic. Are they the states that are being penalized by the Electoral College in the sense that their Electoral College weight is too little for their popular vote weight? No, that's the states down here. Florida suffers the most from that. It's a high turnout, big state, growing state. It generally doesn't have as many electoral votes as it should. Its popular vote share is higher. But this compact isn't about the revenge of states who don't like that they're getting shortchanged with Electoral College. It's just a Democratic thing that Democrats think it'll help them, Republicans think it'll hurt them. They might not even be right. But on that logic alone, I don't think it's likely to pass. We're sort of using up the really dark blue states, unless somehow some Republican-leaning states can be persuaded to join in. All right, I have used up my time. I won't talk about the legal question of whether it's a compact. I will stop sharing my screen and see if people would like to ask questions about the past or the present or even the future, if I risk.
Thanks so much, Professor Gaines. That was a great session, and I feel like you got a lot into 45 minutes or so, and we've had some questions coming in. So David asks, it seems like there has been a higher density of controversial elections in the 21st century than in earlier centuries. Why is that?
Yeah, I think that's true, but I didn't I didn't give you a full list. I skipped 1800. Fans of the musical Hamilton will be upset because his two arch rivals fought it out. Um, it's in the end, I'm saying I think the extremely close elections are extremely close in the Electoral College. Are very hard to resolve otherwise. We've had more of them more recently, but 1876, those 1880s elections, there were a bunch there. There's sort of a pocket of them, a lull, a pocket of them. I think the right answer to your question is it's a hard one to answer. It takes a combination of conditions that we have a stable two-party system as we have now, where it's disrupted a little bit by Ross Perot and some other fairly recent cases. But we're not in the world of the pre-Civil War where the parties are splintering, and that lots of states are not close, but collectively they turn out to be close. So Yes, I don't think it's because of the Operation Electoral College as such. It's about sort of the distribution of partisan leanings across states, and that's changed a lot. And we're in a second period where anybody can win.
Speaking of the Electoral College, we have a very sort of procedural question, which is how are the electors to the Electoral College chosen?
Yeah, they're so we have that fellow in Oregon who shouldn't have been chosen because he held a public office. They're chosen by the campaign, so they're chosen as loyalists. I didn't have time, so I didn't talk about faithless electors, but we've had I keep talking about footnotes and asterisks, a number of instances of electors who are pledged to vote. They're chosen by a campaign because they're going to be a loyal Democrat or Republican, and then they break their pledge and vote a different way. The most recent cases are a couple of funny ones. In 2000, it was a protest vote, a DC elector who knew that Bush had won and her vote wasn't going to make the difference and was protesting DC not having statehood. In 2004, John Edwards got a vote for president, and it was a mistake by a Minnesota elector. Nobody was protesting anything. Nobody fessed up and said, this is my protest against the Minnesota North Stars having left for Texas or any such thing. It was just a mistake. But the electors are human. They can make mistakes. There's a strain of argument that says we should probably just have automata who are the electors, not use real humans. Almost certainly that would require a constitutional amendment. But they're usually anonymous. Some of these in Alabama in 1960, one of those Democrats was a former governor. So sometimes they're prominent individuals, but most people in most states have no idea who the electors are, can't name them, and this election is in the hands of the parties.
You talked a little bit, obviously, about instances where the Electoral College kind of can't come to a decision. And so Diane asks, um, with the current, timeline for elections, is it the current representatives or the newly elected who would decide the election if there were a tie in the Electoral College this season?
If it happens this time, it's going to be the new House. So it's changed because the dates for Congress convening after an election changed. In the past, it took a long time after the election before the new members were seated. Now they're seated early in January, and then they have to certify the electoral votes almost right away, and then the president's inauguration comes later. So it would be the new House. So when I showed you the 1960 results, that was the new House elected in 1960. So who started the sit in 1961. Had it gone to the House in 2000, it would have been the members of the U.S. House were elected concurrently with George Bush, just barely beating Al Gore. We don't know who's going to control the House after 2024. If it's looks like forecasts, probably the Republicans will have the majority of the House delegations, because in the end, it's not control of the House that matters. It's control of the most states. The one member states, it's an easy call. So in Delaware and Alaska, all the states have only one U.S. representative. Some of them could tie. There are states with two, and if it's a tie, then the state effectively abstains. So I don't actually know who would necessarily win if it went to the House, but my best guess is the Republicans will be in a better position.
Um, Changing tack a little bit, what steps can be taken to reduce partisanship and election tabulation and vote counting?
It's a huge question, and I, I think I could say I have a book in press, and I've got the perfect recipe. I don't think there is a perfect recipe. I think part of the complexity is Americans like to vote on things. We have these long ballots. They're pretty unusual. Most places in the world, people cast one or two votes. You go and vote for one member to be your member of parliament, and you're done. Maybe you vote for an upper house and a lower house, or there's maybe a list system. You cast three votes, but we vote on 20 or 30 things often. That makes for messiness. It's a lot of people expressing a preference, and it's a lot of preferences. And inherently, there's some difficulty in the expression of the preferences, and so inherently, the tabulation is not totally controversial. It's not something where there's no possibility for some sort of partisan fingers on the scale. I think there's not a great deal of that. What worries me most is the sort of, conspiracy theories and the belief that the tabulation is fraudulent. And one thing that has made that worse actually was remote voting. It was gradually increasing the opportunities to vote with an absentee ballot or a remote vote, a mail ballot, whatever it's called. The states use different terminology, but voting at home or and then submitting the ballot was increasingly popular before the pandemic, and then the pandemic made it much more popular. In almost every state, made it easier to do. That doesn't have to result in a slower tabulation, but it usually does, usually because the rules are designed to protect the anonymity. You can lose your anonymity with, certainly the vote is not a secret ballot necessarily anymore. Once you're voting out of the booth, that's one cost, but you can also lose your anonymity if the tabulators have a signature and a name on a ballot, and they open it up and they know how the vote was cast, and they could record that. The vote is no longer necessarily anonymous. So rules that are designed to protect that also mean the tabulation usually is done afterwards. And then lots of states have tried to say, just in case the ballots take a while to get there, let's let them come in late. All of that means tabulation is slower. The slower the tabulation, the more conspiracies abound. So I wish there were a quick way to say what we need a quick tabulation, very, very transparent. The more volunteers, the better, but it's hard to get volunteers. And the election officials are in a tough situation. They're getting a lot of heat. They were pretty anonymous in the past. It's even, to some degree, it's not a great time to be an election official. And then this sort of combination of changing the mode of voting and allowing for later ballots to come in has meant the counts are slower. And when the counts are slower, suspicions just get rampant. So I hope people can communicate that there are reasons for a slow count that aren't somebody cheating. But I do think, my worst fear about 2024, if it comes down to a one-state election, it's close enough. I don't know that it will, but it might. Everything hangs on one state, and that one state is slow with the tabulation, and there are any of the kind of irregularities that are not very uncommon. Ballots that turn up late that somehow were misplaced, or dispute about what to do about ballots that aren't postmarked, and a court decision that says the law that people thought was in place is not the right law, or there's inconsistency across counties. All of those things create huge anger and exactly the kind of distrust that we hope not to have. So I don't have a great formula for transparency. I hope for transparency. I hope for people being somewhat patient. And if the best thing officials can do is to be completely clear about if there's slowness, why there's slowness, and shine as much light as possible on the tabulation on exactly what's going on. And then so hope for the best. And people like me should say, talk as much as we can about why a delayed vote is not necessarily a stolen vote.
Um, Thinking about things that do give people cause for concern, we've gotten a couple of questions about gerrymandering. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that is affecting modern political votes.
I could easily talk for another 90 minutes with gerrymandering, but it's not a big story for the presidential vote. So the apportionment is important. How many House seats you get determines how many electoral weight, the electoral weight of the state, how many electors you have. But the way the districts are drawn is not important. It's important in Maine and Nebraska only because in those states, the drawing of the district determines the partisan skew of the district, and then you can get an elector. The Democrats can grab one in Nebraska, the Reaps can maybe get one in Maine, and they balance each other off. If other states were using the congressional district allocation system, then gerrymandering would certainly matter. There's no question there's a lot of gerrymandering. Illinois is a state with a very, very plainly gerrymandered map. Democrats drew it very skillfully to take something like a 55-45 state and turn it into a 14-3 Democratic House delegation. There are Republican states that are gerrymandered. It's a big issue, a big problem, but it isn't the problem for the presidency, except it would be if other states followed the Maine and Nebraska example. In Maine and Nebraska, it's not actually, because they're both small, they're only 2 and 3 districts. I think it's actually presently not really part of the story here at all.
We've got time for a couple more questions. So we just had one come in. I think this is probably a reaction to your answer from the previous question. Is machine counting or hand counting more accurate?
I should talk about 1960 there in a way, I guess. There were multiple recounts. What was clear was the hand counts looked like in the city of Chicago, they were somehow or other, they were missing Republican votes at a much higher rate than Democratic ones. It looked like it was dishonest counting. But there was machine voting then, and the old story about the Cook County was you'd go in and warm up the machine by casting, the election worker would say, let's just make sure it's working. Yeah, and cast 15 Democrat Kennedy votes in and say, it's working, now let's let the people in. There are ways to cheat on everything. I think the really close recounts often have turned on, they've been decided by court decisions about how to proceed with the recounts, or which ballots will be included, which won't be included, more so than what's the mode of recounting. The tough calls, when people remember the Florida people holding up chads and thinking, is this punched through? What do we do with this one? It's partly through, there's a hanging chad. Um, there's just either the law is exceptionally clear, or it's clear, but it's not implemented consistently, or it's not clear and you get a tough call. The Minnesota Senate recount case when Al Franken and Norm Coleman were within a few hundred votes, part of it turned on these crazy ballots, people who, with a paper ballot, had drawn cartoons and written obscenities, but also cast a vote. And is this a spoiled ballot, or does this one count? Um, and I think in that kind of error, it's extremely hard to say that there's a right way to do the recount, there's a right way to do the tabulation. To write that off as a standard error of voting, that we don't really, in the end, know exactly what the will of the people of Minnesota or Florida was in those cases. We know it was in a range, and one party, there's going to be official tabulation, one party's going to win, one's going to lose. But there's enough messiness in the voting that when it's that close, you're stuck counting the inherently ambiguous ballots.
So I think in the interest of time, this will probably be our last question. But kind of bringing it up to modern day, you've talked a little bit about some things that people should keep in mind, about slow ballot counts and things like that. But given that we are looking at likely another very close election, potentially contested election, what's the number one thing that you would like people to keep in mind as we enter November and start seeing results come in?
I don't know if this is the number one thing, but it just occurred to me another thing that drives people bonkers is exit polls. If the exit polls said someone won and then the other candidate wins, surely there was some cheating. That proves the tabulation was fraudulent. Exit polling has gotten much harder, partly because of remote voting. People aren't actually voting in person, so doing an exit poll at the polling station doesn't get you the full set of voters. But exit polls have always been subject to error, like all polls, and so I think that in many of the very close years, somebody writes a book afterwards saying they have solid proof that the tabulation was fraudulent because of the difference between the exit polls and the tabulation. People shouldn't take any polls that seriously. There's error in every poll, including the exit polls. Beyond that, I guess I'm hoping for patience. I didn't even talk about, 1876 wasn't about, there was vote suppression, but then in the end, it was about which of these slates of electors will be counted, so that tabulation of the electoral vote, not the popular vote. We could certainly end up with a position like that again. The states have largely, the movement over time has been making constraints on electors stronger. So the faithless elector who wants to surprise the country, and even though he's a pledged Trump voter, vote for Harris or vice versa, and so on. It's harder in more states for that to happen, but it's not impossible. So I'm. This isn't really something I'll ever gonna do, but I'm hoping we don't end up with such a close election that we get an anomaly that hasn't even come up in these historical cases of electors behaving badly in sufficient numbers to flip the result. That we've had faithless electors, but not to flip results. So hope we don't get that. I hope it's not down to one state with a messy popular vote. They're both possibilities. And I guess I'll end on that mildly pessimistic note.
Well, thanks so much. I think you've given us all a lot to think about over the course of the next, 11 days or so. We really appreciate it. And I, for one, learned a lot and hope that our alumni enjoyed tuning in as well. So thanks to everyone for joining us. As a
Thank you.
reminder, a recording of tonight's presentation will be available on our website within the next 10 business days. We hope to see you again on December 17th for an evening with Chancellor Jones. Have a great evening and ILL.